Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Yale Club of DC's virtual book talk with Jim Sciutto, Yale College class of 92. I am Yvette Rivers, and I'm currently president of the club's board of directors. So before we get into our program with Jim, I wanted to just make a few announcements about upcoming events and just a few administrative notes for everyone. So next Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. Eastern, we are partnering with the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance to have a virtual conversation with our three 2020 Yale DC Community Service Fellows. So each year, the Yale Club of DC awards paid community summer fellowships to current Yale undergraduates who spend the summer interning at nonprofits in DC at no cost to the nonprofits themselves. So the interns are wrapping up their summer internships, and which have been unique this year because it's the first time the internships have been virtual. So should be interesting to hear from them and to give them our support. So 2 weeks after that, we are having a virtual conversation with Emmy Award winning CBS Sunday Morning correspondent Connor Knighton. He's class of '03, and on his latest New York Times bestseller, Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia to Zion Journey Through Every National Park. We're actually partnering with Yale Blue Green DC on that event, and Gary Barrett, who's president of the Yale School of the Environment's Alumni Association Board, will be moderating it. So if you're interested, we'd love to have you. Please go ahead and register and join us. So, and just a few administrative notes about how our session is going to work today. Please do remember to keep yourself on mute throughout the session unless you are asking a question later on in the Q&A period, because after Jim's talk, we will have a Q&A time to address all the questions that you have for him about his experience with this book and what he learned. So you have two options for the questions, and we'll revisit this again, but if you'd like, as you are listening to Jim's initial talk, if you want to just enter a question into the chat functionality, that's an option. Or later on, you could also just raise your hand and we'll call on folks to ask questions live, essentially. So, and then last but not least, we are recording this session, so wanted to make sure everyone is aware of that. So without further ado, we are thrilled to have our very first repeat speaker at the Yale Club, CNN's Jim Sciutto. Jim was kind enough to do a book talk for us right after he released his last book, The Shadow War, and we were so pleased when he included us in his virtual book tour for his latest book, The Madman Theory, Trump Takes on the World. So Jim, hopefully we're starting a new tradition here. You know, for every time you release a book, we'll be part of your book tour. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Jim's background, but just in case you're not, Jim is CNN's chief national security correspondent and anchor of CNN Newsroom. You know, he's spent more than 2 decades as a foreign correspondent, stationed all over the place in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and returned to DC to cover the Defense Department, the State Department, and other intelligence agencies for CNN. He's won many awards, including Emmy Awards also. And most importantly, he is a Yale graduate and a Fulbright Fellow. So please join me in welcoming Jim Sciutto.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yvette. Thanks to all of you as well for taking time out of your evening. I'm grateful. I'm always grateful when people do that. And it's particularly gratifying when I get to link into the Yale community again here in Washington or more broadly. Last week I did a talk for the Yale Club in New York, which was great, my hometown. So it's nice to do it in my new hometown, DC. So thanks to all of you. I wish, of course, it was in person. And I always say now that 2020 is one endless Zoom call. I'm sure you feel the same way. Even doing our show these days on CNN feels like a Zoom call too. Everybody's in their little boxes, and we have the same technical hiccups that I know that all of us have, whether it's work or school or family conversations. But we'll, regardless, it's better this than nothing. And the good side of this, actually, I find is that, with these things, you actually get more people involved, right? Because it's pretty easy for me to come to you from my living room and for you to come to me from your living room or wherever you're sitting tonight. So thank you. And thanks as well to Yvette for inviting me back. So little about how I came to and decided to write this book, and the name of the book too. But let me just start with the process on this. Really less than a year ago, after my last book, The Shadow War, the publisher came back to me, my editor, and said, listen, I'd really like someone to write a book on Trump's foreign policy, America First, how it's impacted the world, 4 years in, I'd love you to do it. You've spent a lot of time in these places, et cetera. And I said, yeah, I'd be interested in doing that as well. Then he dropped the bomb and said, but this has to come out before the election, so I need the manuscript in 6 months. And my jaw dropped a little bit. That's a tight timeline. I had to ask my wife for permission, understandably, with 3 little kids. But the biggest thing is I said, listen, let me start reaching out to folks in the administration to see if they'll speak to me about this. Because, I said, if I'm going to write this book, I got to be able to speak solely to folks who worked in the Trump administration to get a view inside, right, of the president's decision-making, how he came about to develop this approach to the world, what it means, and so on. And once I started speaking to folks in the administration, both folks who had left already or folks who were still in, I found surprisingly nearly across the board they wanted to talk. And I asked them to go on the record because I didn't want this to be a blind quote book. There are too many of those, and by and large, folks agreed. And these are folks who serve the administration who have become critics after leaving, as well as folks who remain loyalists to the Trump view of the world. So then I just buckled down and said, okay, let's figure out a way to get this done in 6 months. And it worked out somehow. A lot of work, a lot of concentration, a lot of patience for my wife and kids. The way I came to this title, The Madman Theory, for folks here who are students of history, it'll be familiar to you from the Nixon years. Nixon famously, he didn't quite originate the madman theory, because you could trace it back to Machiavelli, who talked about, making your adversaries think you're, if not nuts, certainly aggressive. Nixon put a finer point on it by taking it to the nuts level, right? I mean, he explicitly directed Henry Kissinger at the height of the Vietnam War to communicate to the North Vietnamese that he was just mad enough to launch a nuclear strike on North Vietnam. There are White House tapes of these conversations, transcripts of which I quote in the book, and he dictates to Kissinger the language he should use when communicating that to the North Vietnamese, and Kissinger dutifully did it. It didn't work. The North Koreans did not back down. They hung tough in those negotiations. You know how that war ended. There was no kind of softening of the North Vietnamese side there, which was Nixon's intention to get sort of a more favorable way out of the war. But Nixon and his team came to own the madman theory. H.R. Haldeman writes about it in his memoirs as a viable and useful way of conducting foreign policy. So 50 years later, we have a new president with a very unconventional approach to the world, but someone who promised to disrupt not only domestic policy, but also international policy. And President Trump, you've probably heard him both during the campaign and as president claim to have a way of keeping folks on the other side of a negotiation off balance, right? He doesn't claim to be mad, but he does claim to surprise, to swoop in with a surprise concession or demand at the last minute, raise the level of threats to the nth degree, whether in a trade negotiation or a national security negotiation with war at stake, and then maybe pull a 180 and back down and try something different. We've seen that with North Korea. We've seen it with Iran. We've seen it in Syria. So Trump's madman theory, kind of a New York real estate version of it, but applied to the world writ large, but also based on the accounts of folks I spoke to for this book, more the product of his own seat of the pants decision making than any explicit strategy. they could not discern and did not witness moments where the president sat down and described the steps that he would follow to get from point A to point B in a negotiation. It was much more on a phone call, just saying, you know what, I'm going to pull those troops out of Syria. I think that's the right thing to do. I'm going to launch planes to attack Iran for shooting down our drone, but pull them back when they're in the air. That was too far, right? I mean, I'm going to threaten fire and fury on North Korea, and then in a minute, I'm going to turn it around and claim a love affair with the North Korean leader. So Trump's madman theory is, to some extent, a madman theory by accident rather than by design, but with very real dangers. And frankly, in my conversations with folks who worked with him at the most senior levels, real doubts about his decision-making at the highest level, to the point where his advisors often did their best to rein in his worst compulsions or flat out block his decisions. I tell the story about how not once but twice in Syria, when the president, in this kind of madman style, reversed summarily U.S. policy in Syria following successive phone calls with the Turkish president, and then tweeted out an order to withdraw all forces. He did this in December 2018, surprising everyone who works for him and every commander in the field, following a phone call with Erdogan. And he did it again in October 2019. Another call with Erdogan, tweeted, we're out. Now, in both instances, senior military commanders tried to find a way to, if not reverse the decision, limit it, and find a way, frankly, to keep troops on the ground. After December 2018, their initial reaction was, oh boy, we're screwed. And then they started to ask, well, did he say when we want to have the troops out by? And did he say exactly how many? No, he didn't. Okay, so let's withdraw several hundred of them, but not all of them, and see if his attention turns. One of the folks I interviewed in the book, those are his exact words, see if his attention turns. And it did. He just stopped paying attention. They reduced the footprint, but about 1,000 troops stayed on the ground, kept their mission up next to the Syrian Kurds, kept fighting ISIS. 10 months later, President Trump gets on the phone with Erdogan again, no preparation. In fact, the guidance prior to that phone call was, don't trust what Erdogan says. We don't trust his intentions in Syria. But the president gets on the phone. Erdogan says, you don't need to be there anymore. Trump says, fine, we're out. After that, Pentagon fears, right, that the gig was up. But then they started thinking, well, maybe there's another way to get around the president here. And that's when they suggested this idea of redefining the mission as being one to protect the oil fields, something that would appeal to the president because there was something financial involved. The president liked the idea that the U.S. might be earning money out of this war via the oil. Illegal, but the president liked the idea. So they recast the mission to protect the oil fields, which is true. They did protect the oil fields, but they maintained, and still to this day, maintain a counter-terror mission there alongside the Syrian Kurds. Smaller footprint again, but something. And it's just an example of where, one more example of where his closest advisors did their best to find a way to rein the president in and keep the country's stated mission there of fighting ISIS going, right? Because they believe this is in America's national security, whatever the president has to say. And it's interesting, in the last couple of days, the president talked about that Syrian oil again. He does still seem to believe that the U.S. is there to get money from Syrian oil. It's not really the way it's playing out, but if you speak to folks in the Pentagon, if that's what keeps the old man happy, and we can keep some forces on the ground and not abandon the Syrian Kurds, that's okay. There have been losses there, lots of territory lost to Russia and Turkey, but they kept something. That pattern of the president's advisors trying to hold him back was not limited to Syria. I tell the story in the book in late 2017 at the height of tensions with North Korea that his advisors held back military options from the president because they were afraid the president would use them and get the U.S. in a very bloody war with North Korea. You may remember at the time, this was after North Korea had done its 6th nuclear test in late 2017, its largest. The U.S. believes a thermonuclear weapon, damning and shocking development, the discussion of a bloody nose strike. The president had this idea in his mind that there was a limited military strike that the US could do to bring North Korea to the negotiating table. No one in the Pentagon I spoke to believed that such a thing existed, because their analysis was, and US Intel's analysis was, that any limited strike would be interpreted by North Korea as the beginning of a decapitation strike. And North Korea would then respond by raining hellfire down on Seoul, which they're capable of doing. They've got hundreds of artillery pieces aimed at Seoul with both conventional weapons, chemical weapons, and the US Intel estimate at the time was that a limited military conflict like that would cost tens of thousands of lives, tens of thousands in Seoul, South Koreans, but also Americans. You got loads of Americans and soldiers and their families living there. So the Pentagon hesitated to deliver all those options to the president's desk. And I was told by Joseph Yun, who at the time was the lead negotiator, in effect, for the US with the North Koreans, that he also took really the remarkable step of communicating to the North Koreans that he did not know what the president was going to do, that he was unpredictable. And that was not a tactic to sort of put the North Koreans on their back foot. That was a warning, because he and others were worried about this being a march towards war. The other folks who were working against the president to hem in his worst impulses were the South Koreans. And the way Joseph Yun tells it, the South Koreans reached out to the North Koreans to say, we got to sit down and do something here, because we don't want to go to war. That distrust in the president's decision-making is fairly consistent. It came up again, in the height of tensions with Iran in 2019, where you had US military officials from the Pentagon. I'm not talking about wilting flowers. I'm talking about Pentagon officials who, via allies in the Middle East, communicated to Iran, once again, president is unpredictable. We have to be communicating because we don't want to go to war here. A level of distrust in his decision-making that infiltrates the highest levels of the most crucial agencies, departments of this government, and right into the White House and the National Security Council as well. It's interesting. You had the most recent in a string of former senior officials, political appointees in this administration come out just in the last couple of days. A former DHS official, political appointee, talking about the president, and the president imagining magical authorities that he had to do things, and talking about the deep doubts across the DHS about the president's decision making. The president dismissed him as a disgruntled employee. But what's interesting and notable, if you look at the view of the way this president makes decisions, his motivations, etc., that you hear from a whole host of folks who left the administration, and we're not talking about closet Democrats here. We're talking about dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, senior military officials, et cetera. But look at the criticism from Mattis, Kelly, Tillerson, Bolton, this most recent DHS official, the people quoted in my book, Sue Gordon, former near director of national intelligence, one level below that, the president kicked her out, Joseph Yun, North Korea negotiator, Pentagon officials, Fiona Hill, his Russian negotiator, McMaster, former national security advisor, is of a president whose decision-making is erratic, but also, and this is the arguably more worrisome thing, is that his priorities are kind of screwed up in many instances, where they doubt whether he's working for his own interests, whether they be political interests, or even sometimes influenced by business interests, or the country's national interest. And also not just a president who is skeptical of intelligence, but a president who outright denies facts, information. Sue Gordon, who as I noted, she became principal deputy national director of intelligence, 30 some odd years in the CIA. She talks about him, and again, this is a consistent view of a super confident leader. Nothing wrong with that, but quite an overconfident one in his own decision-making. And she makes the point, it's okay if you reject my opinion or analysis, right? President has a right to do that. But she describes many instances where the intel community knows something, right? They're not just guessing. They know. They can look at the picture of the missile on the launch site, or, they intercepted the communications describing Putin's intent to interfere in the election in 2016 and again in 2020. There are times where they know, and the president would ignore that, either because it doesn't fit his view or that information is inconvenient to whatever position he staked out. So it's the decision making, both erratic, not fact based. In addition to that, the worry from his senior advisors is the priorities are skewed, either a mixing of personal interest with the national interest, or sometimes a trumping, excuse the word, of national interest for personal interests. The Ukraine story, you're familiar with this by now, but I tell it in detail in this book. There was no one who served in his administration who was involved in that decision making who did not see it as a straight up political play, right? It's in the sworn testimony. And then, of course, John Bolton, though he didn't testify, backs it up in his book. But that, this was a presidential directive to get damaging information on Joe Biden and to use military assistance to an ally at war as the leverage to do that. There's no one who was involved in that whole process who denies it. No one. And they testified under oath, or wrote a book about it. So you see that play out in very real form. So that allegation of the trumping of the national interest for personal interest is not one that is made lightly by these folks, or in passing, or without basis. It's based on experience, played out in interactions in the spaces that occupied, marked by America's most crucial national security interests: a Syria, and Iran, a China, and a Russia. Let's talk about Russia, and I do want to go to questions because I look at all the participants here, and we got smart people on this call, so I want to give you guys a chance to direct the conversation where you want to go. What is it with Trump and Russia? So I asked everybody I interviewed that question. The best explanation they could come up with, and yes, I'll be honest here, some had suspicions about whether the Russians have compromising information on the president. I didn't print that in the book because suspicions aren't enough for me to put that out there unless they have the goods on it. What they did have experience of is this, and this is based on the president's comments and his decision-making and his interactions with Putin, that the president has an admiration for Vladimir Putin, that he has an envy for the power that Putin has. In addition to that, that he shares with Putin a nihilistic view of the world. Let me explain. That this is not a president who believes in American exceptionalism. That we are all dirty players in a dirty game. That's certainly the way Putin views the world, and that's the way Trump views the world. And that explains public comments from the president. You'll remember his interview with Bill O'Reilly in 2017, early in his term, when O'Reilly pressed him and said, well, but Putin's a killer. And Trump said, but we're not that great either. I'm paraphrasing. More recently, after the intelligence not only about Russian bounties paid to the Taliban in Afghanistan this year, but Russia buying arms for the Taliban in 2018, intelligence by the way, which there is no question about, the president, in answer to that, said, well, we provided arms to them back in the 80s when Russia was there. No difference between the two, in his view. That's a problem for a commander-in-chief with a country. One, listen, I'm not, America's far from perfect. I don't know about you, but most presidents have a view that we're at least more of a force for good than the authoritarian rulers of Russia, who do things like poison opposition leaders on their flights, as we saw in the last several hours today. And they've done that before. So there's that. But it also contradicts U.S. national security policy, because Russia is an adversary whose intent is to damage the U.S. So sharing that view of the world, plus that admiration, is a damaging thing for a U.S. president to have and to feel and to believe. Now, one step further on that, U.S. intelligence's fear was that Russia and Putin have been, in effect, running what's known as an influence operation on the president. An influence op is where you use leverage, you use a warming development of a relationship, you use discussions of things like business deals, etc., shared interests, to, over time, influence that other person's view of things so that it's more in line with your own. And U.S. intelligence saw that play out on this president. That's why they're particularly concerned about conversations that Putin has with Trump, for which there's no record, even the translator. And then, let me take that a step further. They saw instances where Putin's interactions with the president and influence on him changed or influenced the president's views of things. For instance, Fiona Hill talks about how a big source of the president's hostility towards European leaders, Western European leaders, that is, our allies, Angela Merkel, for instance, is Putin. This is an ally. Now, that's not just a thing that makes for uncomfortable summits, right, in Europe. It is a thing that then they worry influences consequential decisions, such as the recent decision to withdraw troops from Germany, a portion of them, big portion. That is a decision no one in the Trump administration pushed for or supports. No one in the national security community, in the Pentagon. In fact, they oppose it. And frankly, no, except with the exception of maybe Rand Paul, no Republicans on the Hill. They oppose it. And there is some effort bipartisan to block this move. The Pentagon, in another instance, is kind of slow rolling this, hoping that the election changes things. Regardless, that being an example of a presidential decision opposed by his senior advisors, opposed by contradictory to U.S. national security policy, and a product of it's the current concern of his advisors, part of this kind of warm relationship between Trump and Putin, and perhaps influence that Putin has in terms of Trump's view of the world. So I've covered a lot there: little Syria, little North Korea, little Russia. I would love to go to questions now again, because I guess we're about halfway through and I want to give you an opportunity. So I will rely on the great Yvette to
Thank
play
you.
Love Peter.
Thanks so much, Jim. Okay, so we actually have some great questions coming in on the chat. We'll start with those, and then I'll unmute everyone, and we'll have a conversation. So with the first question, you spoke about this a bit, but you might want to elaborate a little bit, was from either Andrew or Christine Krause, and asked if you give any credence to the notion that Putin has compromising material on Trump, that such leverage influences the president's view of what's good for him, the Trump personally.
So I don't know. I'm one of many reporters who's followed this story for years now, followed the ongoing investigations of the president and the Senate Intel Committee's own investigations. And again, like I said, in the book, I'm not going to print something I don't know. There are reasonable questions about the level of Russian investment in Trump properties and loans made when Trump couldn't get loans from anybody else in the world, right? And again, go back to some of the public comments, Trump's son saying, we're only doing business with Russians, etc. So that's an open question. I would read the highlights of this most recent Senate Intel Committee report, because there's a great deal in there beyond the headline issue is that there were high-level, as we reported at the time, there were high-level contacts, more extensive than even we knew, between Trump, particularly Trump campaign, particularly Manafort, and Russians tied to intelligence there. That Manafort not only once but repeatedly shared polling data with the Russians, internal polling data. Why? And there is some discussion there of a tape in a hotel in Russia in an elevator. Okay, not the tape everybody's talked about, but something. So those are open questions that deserve investigation, right? And that's one reason why these financial records, and there was a court decision today, of course, on that. Again, knocking down Team Trump's attempt to block that. It may be something that we find out in the near future. It's a grand jury investigation. We'll see if he has charges, but that's as far as we can go in terms of saying anything definitive.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Okay, so we have another question from Tom Herman. Have any other presidents besides Trump and Nixon tried a similar strategy, either Madman or surprise, and how did it work? Any foreign leaders who have tried it?
Hmm. If that's my old friend Tom Herman from Wall Street Journal, hello again. Nice to have you on. The Okay, so I talk about Nixon, and it's interesting talking about Yale ties, but I interviewed Tim Naftali for my book, another Yale grad, a few years ahead of me. I believe he was in the late 80s, and he used to be head of the Nixon Memorial Library, right? And so I spoke to him about those interactions between Nixon, Kissinger, and the North Vietnamese. So yes, Nixon for sure. There have been times, right, where other presidents have threatened action, right, or were comfortable with the other side believing they would do something. I mean, look, it's not quite the same thing. I mean, if you look at Strategic Defense Initiative, right, back with the Soviets in the 80s, it was kind of an empty threat for technology we really didn't have, about kind of a space war, against Russia. Did that move the Russians? It's not quite the same as saying we're going to nuke you, right? Which Nixon said explicitly. So it wouldn't be the first time that a sitting president has threatened something or allowed the other side to believe he or she might do something. But I'd have to. Oh well, Nixon believed, and Naftali talks about this a bit in my book, and more so elsewhere, that Eisenhower helped not win but not lose the Korean War by threatening North Korea at the time with a nuclear attack. Naftali questions whether that is actually what Eisenhower did. He says that Nixon basically incorrectly saw what Eisenhower did, but there was some discussion of that at the time. But I'd have to rely on historians who studied that time period to know exactly what Eisenhower threatened.
Okay, we have some other questions here. Thanks, Jim. So from Lester Kurtz, he says, greetings from South Korea. He so enjoyed your story about Korea. His question was, could you say something about the potential downstream impact of the Madman approach on a future administration, say a Biden-Harris one? Will there be a backlash of expectations from other leaders for a super rational, collaborative approach? How do you see the ongoing ramifications of Trump on U.S. foreign relations?
It is going to be lasting. It can't be reversed easily, whether Trump is out in 3 months or 4 years and 3 months, because he's called into question a whole host of things that you can't. It's like in your personal or professional life, right? Confidence is hard won but easily lost, right? It takes time to build that back. Look at a couple of things. The U.S. signed an agreement with its allies and Russia and China and Iran signed it, by the way, too, to hem in Iran's nuclear program, and then summarily left on its own, right? And now we're snapping back sanctions today, without the agreement of our allies. What is the confidence that the next adversary signs, whether that be Iran for like a 2.0 version of this, or North Korea, right? Sign something and has confidence that that agreement lasts through the next election, right? It's a reasonable question to ask. Our politics are so divided. It's not only domestic policy that rides this pendulum, but now, they have reasonable questions about whether the same might happen in foreign policy. It's interesting. In the book, I have folks in the Pentagon talking about that, how, openly discussing how pulling out of the Iran deal weakened the U.S. position in terms of negotiations with North Korea. Now, as it turned out, North Korea played Trump, whole hog, so it didn't get anywhere. But if you're trying to convince someone that you could stay in a deal, that has a lasting impact. The health of NATO, I can imagine Biden, Harris making a speech the day after the inauguration saying we are all in for NATO. Fine. If Trump is reelected, and you've heard Bolton, but other folks I speak to in my book, concerned that what were half measures in the first term might become full measures in the second term, conceivable he just up and pulls out of it, right? Trump's got an issue with NATO. It doesn't see, McMaster talks about this in my book, he doesn't see the ancillary benefits of alliances. Just doesn't get it. Shared history, shared mutual defense commitment. He sees them purely as financial relationships. What are we spending all this money on? Doesn't get it. And that applies not only to NATO, applies to the U.S. alliance with South Korea or Japan. He talks openly about let Japan have nukes and then we won't have to worry about, defending them anymore. It's so sanctity, credibility of U.S. Agreements, treaties, sanctity, credibility of U.S. alliances, right? That kind of stuff's hard to win back.
Hmm. Okay, so there's a question from Fred Temple. To what extent have Trump's foreign policy decisions been driven by his personal business financial interests? And can you give some examples?
So, the discussion of Trump Tower Moscow is something the president's made his own comments about it. He hasn't dropped that as an interest, right? Talks about it less. The intel officials I spoke to for this book talk about how that's right out of Russia's playbook to discuss business deals as a way to create a relationship. If it was you and me, it might be something small bore. If it's Trump, it's a massive real estate development in Moscow. That's part of their playbook, tried and true. And that's part of the reason why they believe that there has been something of an influence operation underway. So that's real. The interactions with Turkey, another place where president has interest and there are worries within his own administration that affects his decision making. So that's the business side. And then on politics, he's almost transparent on this, right? Can you help me win an election? Bolton's book, he said it right out to Xi Jinping about buying agricultural products. With Russia, listen, make your own conclusions. But 4 years ago, again, read the Senate Intelligence Committee's report. His campaign was communicating with the Russians, even helped time the releases of stolen Clinton documents to help them. I always remind people that the John Podesta emails first dropped 22 minutes after the Access Hollywood tape came out. Not a coincidence, right? That could have been Russia's choice on its own, but we do know that Roger Stone was communicating with WikiLeaks, and we know that WikiLeaks, in the view of U.S. intelligence, was just a middleman in this whole thing, regardless of what Julian Assange says. And now here we are 4 years later, and 10 days ago, U.S. intel said Russia's interfering again to help Trump damage Joe Biden. They are deliberately sending damaging information about Biden via Ron Johnson and others that intel says is tainted information, and the president has not once publicly or to our knowledge privately warned Russia away from doing it. So does that influence the president's decision making? Regardless, the end result is the same.
So another question from Jean Thompson. Why is there not more of a requirement that process be followed on these very important actions, comments, negotiation, formulation of policy, discussion of rollout with those who will apply the decision, et cetera, and transparency and record keeping on behalf of history and the American people down the road? These private meetings with Putin seem in contrast with past practice to our detriment.
It's another example of where what we imagine is our system, our bedrock system, is more norms than laws, right? It's things that were and have been followed by Democratic and Republican administrations to a large extent, for decades, and Trump just stopped doing, right? Talk a lot in my book about, his advisors talk a lot directly about how he destroyed the national security making process. Doesn't exist. They may still make decisions make recommendations, pump out papers, position papers, national defense strategies, etc. But Trump makes the decisions often in contradiction to those strategies and without consulting all those folks. The policy making follows the decision rather than precedes the decision. It was true on Syria, both of those withdrawals. It's been true on, for instance, the president up and saying, I want to invite Putin to, the G7 again. Everybody's like, no, allies, no, but he just says it, So those, you'd like to think that our system, kind of writ large, would preserve some of this, or that elements of the system would push back at the effort by this administration, this president, to knock a lot of that down, but it hasn't borne out that way. It hasn't. And that's we should take pause. And listen, some people have been complicit, right? The Senate has basically ceded its ability to confirm senior administration figures, right? We got like 1,000 actings, and they're just fine with that. It's a remarkable surrender of constitutional powers.
Mm-hmm. So from Paul Bardak, he says, had I joined this wonderful talk late, I wouldn't have been sure whether its topic was senior administration efforts to remove harmful options for the president or my efforts to remove harmful options for my 2-year-old grandson. Are there other examples in U.S. history where presidential aides have had to so significantly limit a president's policy options?
The one that comes to mind is, Nixon in the final days of Watergate, right, where there was open discussion of senior advisors to not let the president do anything crazy, right, in that moment. But that was a short moment, right? This is one that's playing out over years, and it doesn't. I'm not saying they stood in the way of every presidential decision, right? Because the president's made a lot of consequential decisions. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. So they can't, even the most skeptical advisors can't block everything. And the fact is, over time, he has filled those posts with people less and less likely to challenge him. There are no more Mattises left. And a lot of the positions are just flat out empty, or they're occupied by, the idea that Rick Grinnell was the acting director of national intelligence is just incredible. It's incredible. He's a political operative. And you look at the folks who filled that position in the past, right? Like Jim Clapper had 50 years in intelligence going back to the 60s, led agencies. It's just and the moment he got in there, he did a loyalty purge or a disloyalty purge. So, there is the extent of, listen, Trump's not the first president to use executive orders, right? We know that Obama did, but it's a matter of degree and extent and frequency, right? And that has consequences as well.
Another good question here from Larry Franks is, quote, impartial, end quote, news reporting vis-a-vis Trump possible? Would it require a reporter to abandon factual reporting and to, in effect, give falsehoods and fantasies unwarranted credence?
Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. In the current environment, if you uncover something uncomfortable for this president or critical, you are called by some quarters partisan, right? Mm-hmm. He'll call you fake news. His allies will, and then the kind of Fox News, social media kind of bubble machine, they're out every day. They'll tweet at me every day too, in the various ways that they do it, often unfounded or misleading. So, all we could do is try to cover this president, hold him accountable, uncover what we can that is being deliberately hidden and folks wouldn't know about otherwise, and try your best to follow journalistic practice as you do it, right? Confirm what you know as best you can, talk to as many people as possible. And, in the current environment, listen, we're in an environment now where even, forget about news reporting, just straight up facts. How many people have died from COVID is a political question in this country right now. The number of people who have it, whether wearing a mask that all the science says X, we've moved so far down through the looking glass that it's, and I'm not saying there isn't partisan journalism, critical of Trump. There is, and I, as a old news guy who cut my teeth at the Yale Daily News, right? But spend most of my time as a foreign correspondent too. I don't like to see editorializing from the anchor chair or elsewhere, regardless of which network it's coming from, right? Yeah. So I do think that our current level of discourse has given more license to that than I'm comfortable with. But in terms of what we do, all we could do is do the job as best you can, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of damn the consequences to some degree, because you're never going to please. It's interesting, this book, I bent over backwards to, first of all, speak to, I mean, follow journalistic practice, right? Speak only to people who knew firsthand, and make sure that you speak to folks who had a critical view, yes, of this president, but also folks like Navarro and Bannon, arrested on his boat today, who I talked to for this book, to get their view of why they believe the president's approach works. All you could do is follow that practice. Fox News wrote a piece about my book, calling it how could I call myself a journalist when I write this biased anti-Trump book? And I was like, you didn't even read the book. First of all, they wrote the piece before the book was out. I know they didn't have a copy, and we hadn't shared it with anyone at that point. They just said, it's an anti-Trump book. I was like, did you read the book? No. Washington Examiner, which is a conservative outlet, as you know, did a review of my book and called it very fair. So it's like, sometimes the attack comes before even looking at anything, right? Just the way it is.
So a question from Alan Cohen. Do any of Trump's advisors believe that he is overtly delusional?
As in, do you mean, if I could ask back, do you mean mad? Not mentally sharp? Is that what you mean by delusional?
Here, let me unmute this, since whoever asked the question could go ahead and share here. All right, I've unmuted everyone. We're going to turn the last 15 minutes into a discussion. If you don't want to chat, just mute yourself back. All right, so let's see. Now going back here. My interpretation, if he doesn't want to say anything, is delusional, like insane delusional.
So insane. No, insane. Fair enough.
Yes.
Okay. Tell it like it is. No one said to me insane. Now, that can give you comfort. On the other hand, he is, to paraphrase the president, he is what he is, right? He doesn't think the rules apply to him. He lies, not just to you and me, but to his advisors, to people who work for him. He thinks he knows better than everyone, pretty much. He will be delusional in the sense that when presented with information that is inconvenient for him, doesn't fit his view, or doesn't fit his position, he'll ignore it. So doesn't let facts get in the way of a good story or position. And often is playing for his own account, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that could all be the actions of a sane person, but one that can be damaging. Now, read the sections from Bannon and Navarro. They describe someone who is rightfully bucking a Washington establishment that has gotten a lot of stuff wrong. And they're right about that, right? China's an example, right? I mean, you had successive Republican and Democratic administrations imagine China was going to change for the good over time. We've got to figure it out. No. And Trump said enough of this. And listen, there's bipartisan support for that general position today. That's the position least likely to change in a Biden-Harris administration, just sort of general confrontation with China. Steve Bannon makes the point that, Trump is speaking for the deplorables, right, with a lot of these policy moves. The trade deals didn't work for them, right? A lot of people profited, but not them. A lot of them lost their jobs. And the quote unquote little endless wars didn't work for them either. It's Bannon makes the point that it's like, he says the deplorables lost their jobs and then they sent their kids to fight in these wars, right? And there is this kind of socioeconomic kind of thing there. It's not all across the board, but so you got to listen to that too, right? You ignore that feeling and that experience at your own peril, which the Democrats found out in 2016, right?
Mm-hmm. So everyone, I've unmuted people who, so anyone want to ask Jim a question live, feel free to go ahead and speak up now. People are shy sometimes on these Zoom calls. I do have a couple other questions, but hi, go ahead. There we are. Andrew, did you have a question? Okay, I'll take the next question here.
There's a follow-up.
Yeah, so a question from Gwen Ito. Do you think the US press has done a good job of covering the Trump presidency? If you could rewind the past 4 years, would you do anything differently?
So yes, I would. Big picture, have we done a good job? I think we've done a pretty good job. I mean, listen, obviously I'm biased, I'm coming from the press, but let me make the case here. You had a lot of bad activity by this president administration exposed by good reporting. You know, there's a lot of things you wouldn't know. I mean, the Trump Tower meeting in 2016, right? June 2016 was discovered by the New York Times, right? You know, later revealed by other things, including the various investigations. But you've had a whole, David Fahrenthold, if you read his stuff at the Washington Post, does a great job documenting the Trump Foundation's shady business, right? Just by hard gumshoe reporting, So CNN, we discovered a lot of the early, it's interesting, sorry not to brag, but in February 2017, I reported that there were repeated high-level contacts between the Trump campaign and Russians with ties to intelligence. I had that very well sourced and I was confident in it. After I did that story, I got attacked. I got a phone call from Richard Burr, chairman of the Senate Intel Committee, saying, I don't know where you hear this, but it's not true. There were comments in committee about this, blah, blah, blah. Well, 2 days ago, the Senate Intel Committee report, signed by Republicans and Democrats, said there were repeated contacts between the Trump campaign and Russia at the highest level, Paul Manafort, sharing of campaign data, whatever. So it's like, we uncovered some stuff, right? What I wish that we, the media writ large, did a better job of contextualizing each of the outrages, because not everything is a 5-alarm fire, right? And I think there's a tendency that every tweet, everything is a 5-alarm fire, when some things are not, And I think folks kind of like they stick their fingers in the air after the wire. They can't kind of distinguish what's actually that big a deal, because we haven't differentiated so much.
Yeah.
I mean, that plus the editorializing, which I think there should be less of across the board.
Mm. So Lester Kurtz had a follow-up question for you. Lester, are you unmuted? All right. For some reason, I can't hear you, so I think you're going to have to just ask it in the chat, unfortunately. All right. So let's see. Next question was actually from Stuart. What are the prospects of legislative fixes to the loopholes Trump has exploited to flout the norms to which past presidents have adhered?
Well, you'd need to get the votes, right? I mean, simple one would be requiring presidents to release their tax returns, right? Seems that's a pretty low-hanging fruit. We'll see. Other things. I mean, the courts have solved a couple of these problems, right? I mean, they have said that a president cannot ignore every subpoena all the time. That's a victory today, but it's a thing. Let's see, what other legislative things? I mean, I suppose you could legislate out the White House practice. I was going to say who's on phone calls with foreign leaders. That's more of a process, and the president can kind of set that whatever he wants to do. I don't know if Congress could act on that. I mean, the Senate could, or the Congress rather, could recommit the U.S. to NATO, right? I mean, like sort of make something like that. But it's a collection of so many things. It would require a real effort. And some of them, frankly, in our current interpretation of the president's power, the executive branch's power, there's a lot of things that, the next president of either party, this president has shown they can do.
So I'm hoping we have solved the Lester audio issue. Lester, we're going to give you one more try.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yay.
Okay, great. Yeah. This has really been an excellent discussion. Thank you so much. I had asked before about ramifications on foreign policy, and then some of the things that you were just saying made me think about, okay, what are the ramifications of the Trump era on our own identity, on, downstream? Because we've done a lot of thinking. Some people say, well, we got what we deserved by electing him president, and other people say, well, no, this is not who we are. So what's the narrative going forward?
Yeah.
Of course, it's mixed up with the pandemic and the anti-racist uprising as well. But those are all also interconnected, aren't they?
Yeah. Whew. Well, this stuff's not all going to disappear with Trump, right? I mean, the fact that the president today gave a free pass to QAnon, I mean, is so mind-blowing. It's incredible. Now, those folks are not going to disappear after November 3rd, regardless of what happens to Trump. And the corners of the interweb and, right-wing media that kind of fuels this kind of stuff, because it's like, the way it bubbles up from these low levels, but then kind of moves up higher, and in many instances all the way to the White House, but elsewhere, if he's gone, that doesn't disappear. And that's concerning. I mean, we've exposed a lot of open racism in this country, right? That maybe we imagined wasn't there still, but clearly is. The hopeful side of me is that remains a minority, right? And that, and you see some of that in the polling. Let's forget the horse race polling, but on things like, the majority of the country is embarrassed. We had a CNN poll, and I've seen this earlier this week, by the U.S. response to the pandemic. That's just in the numbers. And the majority of Americans recognizes that, the majority of Americans believe whatever, even though it took the president 6 months to do it, that, a mask is a decent thing to kind of help you not get sick, right? On the flip side, the most shocking number, I'm just using this as an example as to how far this stuff, goes in, only 56% of Americans said they would take a vaccine if it was available. That is scary, right? Because that shows the attack on science works. I mean, there's another element of that, which is probably folks worried that this administration might rush a vaccine. But I think there's a significant element of the country that's just like, the government bureaucrats, they're against us all. I don't believe what they're going to say. So that stuff doesn't disappear. And we haven't proven good as a country at knocking it down, right? Because we don't have an accepted reality anymore. You can't even accept hard facts, sadly, on a lot of stuff. And that is, I don't see, it's going to take a lot of work to correct that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So we had a question in the chat and a comment from Elizabeth. She said, thanks for a very thoughtful analysis. Can't wait to read the book. Do you have any insight into why so many former Trump advisors waited to speak out?
Well, some waited, but some didn't, right? I mean, this DHS guy spoke the moment he came out. Bolton, I still don't understand his decision not to testify, if you do. I mean, he waited until the book came out. Others, I mean, Mattis clearly, even though he's out of uniform, didn't want to wade into it as a former military guy, but then I think he just ran out of patience and just said, I got to stand up. McRaven, initially wasn't, but now he's very forward-leaning in his criticism. So I think all of them have made different decisions, some more quickly, some less quickly, and some still quiet. I mean, I will tell you, for this book, I spoke to folks who were blistering in their criticism of the president, but they didn't want to speak on the record about it. And, they're concerned about maintaining lines of communication with the administration, which I get. They are also, and we live in Washington. You might be familiar with this phenomenon of people being concerned about their livelihoods,
Right.
over, which I get, but even some of those folks, they have their limit, right? It gets to a point where they're just like, screw it, man, I gotta come out. So I think everybody has a different kind of timeline and also a threshold.
So Zoe had a comment and then a question. She says, I'm skeptical that there are foreign policy advantages to this level of unpredictability, whether a strategy or not, but I would have expected his advisors to point to advantages. Did they?
So first, to the first part of your question, there is little to no advantage of it in this administration. Susan Gordon makes a point in the book that our adversaries know, this is the phrasing, no, we don't know the next play. They know that this president is unpredictable and his advisors, are kind of like waiting on tenterhooks for him to pull the rug out from under them. They know that and they seek to take advantage of it. Fiona Hill tells stories in the book about how she would be meeting with not just, say, Russian. Looks like I got muted. You guys hear
Sorry.
me? Sorry.
Yes, there we go.
So I was telling a story of Fiona Hill saying when she was meeting with Russian counterparts, but also even allies, and she would state the administration position or priority or something, they would say to her, that's nice and all, but why should I listen to you? President might turn around the next day. So, there have been there are a host of examples of how it undermines the pursuit of U.S. policy, because folks know you're just kind of like grasping at straws here and waiting for the president to make some surprise move. And then countries seek to take advantage. I was meeting with someone in the administration on China just 2 days ago. We were talking about how China senses opportunity now with the pandemic response to push, like in Hong Kong, for instance. So this impression that this sort of madman has made the world live in fear is not borne out by the results on the ground. I mean, look at Kim. The unpredictable. Trump was ultimately unpredictable with Kim. Fire and fury, love affair, and what did Kim do? He just built more nuclear weapons.
Okay, we have time for one more question. So from Fred Temple, given a commitment to report accurately, how can CNN maintain a reputation of neutrality, not another MSNBC?
It gets to the point I was describing earlier. All you could do is do your job, right? In this environment, you'll be attacked for being, I'll just give you an example. Yesterday, I tweeted from the CNN poll finding only 6% of Americans, say they would take a COVID test if it becomes available. And then Tom Fitton, if anybody's heard his name from Judicial Watch, tweeted at me saying, Jim Sciutto of CNN, which is basically a liberal political shop, attacks Americans for not taking a vaccine that doesn't exist yet. And I said, you didn't read the poll. The question was, would they take a vaccine if it existed, right? So it's like you can just state something like, I don't know, it's 75 degrees today, right? And get attacked as a partisan for that. So some of it is you just throw your hands up in the air, right? You gotta, but best thing I think you can do is, right, stick to doing the work, raise the level as best you can of your work, right? Because your credibility is only undermined by mistakes. And we've made mistakes, as have other outlets, but you got to own those mistakes when you have them. And I do think, do your best not to editorialize, right? So you can maintain that kind of middle ground as best you can. It's not easy, though, when you're called every day the enemy of the people.
Right. Well, thank you so much to Jim for joining us tonight and for sharing your insights from your new book, and just for speaking so candidly with us. It was just such a pleasure to have you as our guest. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us. And again, so you're going to write a book every 2 years or more frequently?
I got to take a break for a little bit, if only to keep my children sane and still recognizing my face.
All right. Well, we will just have to watch you on CNN then and read your book. So thanks again to you.
Thanks to you, Yvette, and the whole group. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'll do, as I've said to Yvette from the beginning, I'll do anything for Yale. But it's also such a great reminder of how lucky we were to interact with everybody.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jim. And thanks so much to everyone else. Have a great night.
On Amazon.
Oh, yes. I sent the link. Look at that chat. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.